College is a wild ride for young adults, and their mental health often suffers. This podcast addresses the inner battles many college students struggle with. You're listening to Normalize It Forward, where we have raw, unfiltered conversations about young people's biggest mental health problems, how to handle them, and how to achieve a more resilient mind. Time to get rid of those heavy burdens and focus more on self-love and care. Here is your host, Marc Lehman.
Okay, welcome everybody. Today we have on the show a super special guest to Normalize It Forward, the podcast that openly talks about mental health and wellness and of various topics that surround it. Today we are welcoming Sue Lemke. She's an assistant superintendent of teaching and learning in Simsbury. She's also a lecturer and adjunct professor, educational leadership at Central Connecticut State University, working with aspiring administrators. She began her career in special ed, becoming an adept practitioner in public schools while also developing models for alternative education. As a school administrator, she held various roles at both the building and district levels, including human resources and pupil services. Sue is passionate about ensuring all students succeed in their learning while experiencing connection and a sense of belonging. She resides in Connecticut with her spouse, Eric, and her two daughters, Melita and Maeve. Sue, welcome.
Thank you. It's great to be with you today.
Absolutely. And in addition to all that, she's just a wonderful person who has helped many students, including my own daughter over the years. So I'm super excited to have you on the show and to tap into your wealth of knowledge, Sue, from really a variety of areas. I think that as an administrator nowadays, you've seen a lot, you've been around a lot, and been in, I'm sure, thousands of IEPs and meetings, right? PPT meetings, and, sort of seen things from different angles. And so part of what I really hope to talk to you about today is just sort of the trends of what we're seeing academically with young people nowadays. So we'll get into it.
Okay.
I'm super pleased to have you here. So welcome.
Thanks for having me.
Of course, absolutely. So let's start off with Sue. You've been in education, you've been in the classroom, and you've been out of the classroom. Can you give us a sense as to sort of just kind of capture your career a little bit in terms of where what once was and where it is now?
Sure. So in my teaching capacity, I was a special education teacher, and although I had experiences at the elementary level, I found most of my teaching career at the secondary level, at both middle school and high school. Mm-hmm. And so when you have a background in comprehensive special ed, you have a dabbling in many kinds of different topics and disabilities and how they play out in the classroom environment. And I found myself honing in and specializing with students with emotional difficulties. They were just my jam. Yeah. They usually there's no one characteristic or a set of characteristics because they're all individualized and unique. But I found students at that point in my career, and this was 25 years ago, where students had incredible intelligence, were often not in the what we would call mainstream classroom at that point in time because of their behavior, because of their manifestation of what was going on internally with them and their difficulty with expressing themselves in a way that was socially acceptable in a public school setting. So I found myself really getting excited and passionate about that population. They extremely funny, kept me on my toes, and I believed with certain teaching into a certain skill set, they could absolutely be successful in a general education environment. Mm-hmm. And there were some cases that just wasn't appropriate at that point. And so I became very invested in alternative education for students who weren't demonstrating success in a general education, kind of a typical hours of the day public school environment. how do we think of school differently, and how do we build knowledge and skills in our kids in a different way that was out of what traditional school looked like. So was able to co-facilitate an alternative education program where the actual schooling happened after late afternoon and early evening, with supported work experiences during the day for students, and enabled them a smaller environment with very specific teach into certain skills in a way that they could be successful. So that really became more of my specialty in that secondary environment. And I had an incredible principal at the time. She said, you really should be thinking about how to share your influence on an administrative level. And interesting or not, I was always pretty good at school, right? I could figure out the code and the games and what I should do and shouldn't do, and when I should do that and when I shouldn't do that. And so I went back to school and received my administrative certification, and left the district where I was at Northwestern Connecticut, and moved into a building level administrative role, and was there for a couple of years, and now I've been in the same district for almost 20 years now. So it's exciting work for me. What I love about education is that it's never boring. It's always a set of new challenges and problem to solve. But I think the most important part is that we do that in partnership. We do that in partnership, certainly with other educators, certainly with the students that we're working with, their parents, their families, outside practitioners like you, Marc, community members. It truly takes all of us kind of pulling together in the same direction with good communication and understanding, because we all want the same thing, no matter what seat we have. And that's, we want our child, if we're looking at it through a parent aspect, it's our student as educator, it's a citizen, if it's a community partner, we want them to be successful.
I think that's amazing. And I can honestly say, I was just thinking about other people I've interviewed for the podcast. You're unique in this way, Sue, and that I've worked directly with you and I've seen your impact. And, one of the things that you just do so naturally and so organically is you get students to believe in themselves. And, I think that so often we see young people that have, been beaten down by the system, and made to feel a certain way. And when you treat somebody, equal, like they're a human being and they've got some amazing talents. We all have talents, and it's just a matter of drawing them out, right? You're so good at that. You really are really excellent at that. I've watched you do it, and I know many, many kids over the years have benefited. I'm curious, just because you're around kids all the time, and you probably have this happen. I sometimes will find myself using their lingo, and I'm like, what's going on? I'm like, I'm around kids all the time too. That's why. But we've seen these trends. We've seen these trends with things like depression and things like anxiety, where certainly on the high school level and definitely on the college level, they're trending in the wrong directions. We're seeing, suicide rates go up. We're seeing anxieties go up, and lots and lots and lots of kids are depressed. And I guess I'm curious, like, when you think about your opinion as to maybe why this has happened over the last, let's say, 5 to 10 years roughly, what comes to mind?
I think first and foremost, it's the societal pressures that kids are facing. And certainly when I speak with people from our generation and previously, it's okay, we've always had pressures. And they'll make argument that in many cases, things are easier for kids today. I'm not so sure. I think that technology, I think that it's a blessing and a curse at times,
I would
right?
agree.
I think that we have tools that we put in kids' hands, meaning their cell phones, that are far more complex than the brain development of those holding those phones, right?
Well
and
said.
and so I think that adds a pressure that when we were growing up, and even at my beginning years as an educator, students didn't have access to the world and the expectation the world would have access to them. almost in a 24/7 format,
Yeah.
right? So I got to go home and shut down and focus and work on the task at hand without a notification beeping on my phone, or without worrying about what this group of friends was doing and where they were. And gosh, I wasn't there and I was missing out,
Yeah.
right? Kids talk about this fear of missing out. It's very real.
Yeah.
It's very real. And so we had the ability to be able to say, no, that's over there, and it's really compartmentalized. I don't know if kids have that level of flexibility and, quite honestly, that peace that we did.
Yeah.
And so that worry manifests in, I believe, increased anxiety and increased depression. And I have seen that as an increase, and certainly have a couple of other ideas there as well. Anxiety and fear are often coupled together, and we get to this point sometimes where we're worrying so much about things that we can't control that it starts taking over and it starts being intrusive in our day-to-day functioning. So that I see is hugely different than I did when I started my career.
Yeah. No, I totally agree. And it's funny, I'm smiling because sometimes I'll say to kids, like, if Sue were my friend in middle school, and I wanted to get a hold of her, I'd use my rotary phone, and I'd call her, and I'd probably talk to her mom, and Sue was busy, and I'd leave a message, and maybe Sue would get back to me the next day. And when I tell kids nowadays this, they're looking at me like I'm crazy. But there was a piece that came with that we just sort of, expected. I'm not going to get in touch with Sue right away. And oh, by the way, if Sue's busy, she'll call me when she gets a chance. And maybe when she gets a chance is like next week. Like it's not right away, and so you compare that to what kids have now. And when kids shoot each other a text, if it's been, longer than 10 or 20 seconds, there's these assumptions that get made, right? And as you said, I think there is a driver to, stresses and anxieties with regards to that. I see it all the time.
Yeah.
And we haven't even touched on social media. We'll get to that in a minute. But it's I think for kids, there's that constant pressure, the pressure of, I've got to communicate, I've got to socialize, I've got to connect, I've got to do this, I've got to do that. And they lose track of, like, no, you're supposed to be doing your work, or no, you're supposed to be relaxing, or no, you're supposed to be having dinner with your family,
And I don't have to be on all of the time.
Right.
And I think that there's a perception that if I'm not hooked into my phone, or that, again, something is going on without me, or there's a better experience that's happening that I'm missing out on, instead of prioritizing what's right in front of me, which might be a meal, or my family, or rest, or just a break.
Right. So that kind of brings me to the next topic then. I want to ask your thoughts on this, because we're seeing these trends happening. I don't know if they're quite happening in Simsbury yet, but these trends of, like, schools considering banning phones during the day, and like these different ways they do it and different breaks they get. And I know, I know certain teachers will sort of have the kids put their phones like in cubbies and stuff like that. And I guess I'm curious your thoughts on doing that, and sort of how you see that happening, maybe even in Simsbury.
Yeah, I think both at the middle school and high school this year, there's been a reboot relative to cell phones and the policy. And so I have two girls, as Marc mentioned, as you mentioned, they're 13 and 11, and they're both at our middle school in Simsbury. And they both have cell phones.
Yep.
That was the rule, that they weren't going to get them until they went to middle school. And certainly we have very specific parameters at home about that. They're very well aware they don't own the phone. Dad and I do. And therefore, it's subject to different filters, and I can take that at any time, and I can do spot checks, and I will do spot checks, and all of those things. So when the recommitment to the cell phone policy, and I'll just speak at the middle school for a second, came out, which means as soon as you walk into that building, it's in your locker, locked and away.
That's great.
And very specific actions, not in a punitive way at first, right? But it's this very stepped out process of just what will happen if you choose to do that. And have been very impressed with our administration for setting the context of the why, giving some data and information about, yes, cell phones can be valuable tools within certain contexts, but they can also be incredible distractors to the learning process. And what that data has looked like in research and how that's playing out in the middle school. So we were asked as parents to all go over this recommitment to the cell phone policy. And we were asked as parents to sign saying that we understood, as well as our kids. And they had to sign too, saying we understand. And it's for good reason. And I have to say it's going exceedingly well.
That's fantastic. That's fantastic.
Exceedingly well. Similar things at the high school, they have to be off and away. You know, there's conversations legislatively around putting some practices and mandated policies into play here. And we want to make sure that we're always responding in a way that's appropriate for our community and in our schools. But that's informed decision making. It is hopefully in collaboration with our families as partners and setting up the imperative why, that we don't want to cause further distraction to the learning environment. We want to teach kids how to be present. Yeah. We want to reinforce how we talk with each other and have dialogue without the distraction, again, of worrying about what we're missing out on, because the only thing which we should be focused on here and now is this interaction with each other or this new content that I'm learning about and how to make that engaging.
Yeah, I love it. I love it. I have to say too, I think beyond the academics, the other thing that I notice with it, I'm on a private school campus this year consulting, and they've got a very similar policies that no phones are allowed out, especially outside of the classroom on campus, is that kids are walking with their heads up and they're looking at each other. And I know that sounds so simple and so basic, but when I, as a counselor, sit with a 17 or 18-year-old kid going to college, and I've got to role play how to dialogue and how to have conversation, how to look people in the face, the reason that's happening is because kids have their head down all the time. So right. I think an offshoot, real positive that could come out of this is that kids start to socialize a little bit better. Kids start to look at each other in the face and have dialogue and say, hey, what's up? And hey, what's going on? And like, instead of like, you know, giving you the grunt, you know, they're actually having conversation with each other. They're having conversation with adults, which I think is so important to their overall wellness and well-being. I think it's just, you know, it's one of those things that you kind of have to have, you know, and like, so
certainly. And I think there was another challenge in the education world during COVID, right? We went to a platform that was predicated on technology and clicking in and being on a device to ensure that connection. And that served an appropriate purpose at the appropriate time. And now we have to reteach some of that human interaction. I mean, you and I are on a Zoom right now and making this dialogue happen. But how do you do that? How do you do that in both? And what does good interaction, human interaction look like? And how do I read cues? How do I read when something I've said has struck a chord positively or not so positively? How do I get that feedback and adjust one way or the other as a person? And these are skills that sometimes we've assumed in the past. And I always say it's okay. You just haven't been taught yet, or that teaching hasn't stuck yet. So it's our job to do that as educators.
Right. And I think it's, I don't mean to open a can of worms when I say this, but it's sort of like AI. Like there's positive benefits to it. You know, when it first came out, we branded it as evil, you know, because kids were using it for not so good purposes, but it's become one of those tools that isn't going away and that can benefit kids in certain regards. I think that, you know, virtual is very similar in that, you know, I was on a few weeks ago with a gentleman from a small island in Greece. It was an amazing interview. I had so much fun. There's no way I would have been able to interview this guy unless we had
Right.
virtual. So, I feel like there's benefits that we get, and we just have to sort of look at, okay, those human interaction things that you were talking about in terms of looking people in the face, in terms of, reading body cues, in terms of having conversation, you need to be able to do that in person. You need to be able to do that routinely, because whether it's friends, whether it's staff members in school, whether it's teachers, parents, girlfriends, parents, professors in college, doesn't matter. You're going to be around people forever,
That's right.
and you need those skills. So I'm thrilled to hear that. I'm a big fan of the managing the cell phone use during the day. I think it's good for kids. I think it gives them a break. And it'll be really interesting if there's some studies done over the next couple of years as to how that impacts things.
Agreed.
So we'll see. But wanted to shift and just ask you about another topic that I think comes up a lot: self-care. Self-care is a phrase that's thrown around a lot, and I have my own definition. But I guess I'm wondering, when you think about self-care for a young adult, what does it mean to you?
For me, it means, how do I develop tools and systems and boundaries and structures
Mhm.
so that when life gets hard,
Yep,
because life will get hard,
no
I'm
doubt.
ensuring that I'm taking care of some of my basic needs, like sleep and like eating and exercise, as well as some more developed skills
Mhm.
and coping mechanisms to get through hard and to do hard differently or to do hard better, and to not always worry about stopping when something gets difficult, because you're not going to be able to do that realistically. But when that shows up, when that fear shows up or the hard shows up, I have skills to be able to navigate.
Yeah,
So that self-care is sometimes practicing those skills,
yeah.
sometimes making sure that I am kind of living out those boundaries for myself and with others, and actively practicing them, and doing things that are fun, and trying to give very specific time and space for balance.
Yeah. I love that. And I love what you said. And I think it's funny. I think back to when I was a teenager, you have this kind of thought process of like, life's always going to be good, right? And I like how you said that. Life is a roller coaster. You have your ups, you have your downs. There's health things that pop up, there's financial things that pop up, there's emotional things that pop up. I think self-care to me is one of those things that we can touch, we can actually tangibly choose to do. And that means, if it's midnight and you come across like a great movie, do you sit there and watch it and you're exhausted the next day, or you just go to sleep?
Mm-hmm.
And I think we've all been there, right? We've all been in that spot. For me, it's more usually the New York Yankee games, but but it's, you got to kind of figure out what's best, right? And kind of what your body needs. And I think that eating's the same way. I can't begin to tell you how many young people I come across that'll come to my office at 5 o'clock at night and they haven't had a meal yet. They're
Yeah.
having their first meal at night. They haven't had breakfast. They skip school lunch because they don't like it. And it's like, wow, your body needs nutrients.
Mm-hmm.
So, sort of deciding for a young person, deciding and saying, hey, there's certain things in life we can't change. We can choose to get good rest. We can choose to eat decently. And you don't have to eat perfectly all the time. But I think as long as you're getting your nutrients in, your brain needs that, to be able to take it in.
Yep.
And you and I think have a very similar view of exercise and just physical fitness. And I think, just for so many kids that come into my office that are inundated with stressors, inundated with anxieties, taking a walk in your neighborhood even can be so beneficial. Uh,
100%.
just to clear your head. And I think, there's certain things that I think young adults and us older adults do. I should say me, you're not older, right?
I am. It's okay.
Okay.
You're being gracious, but I
I'm
am. I'm right there
trying
with
to.
you.
So, I think we're just built the same, right? And we need to relieve that stress. And I think when someone puts their shoes on, puts their earbuds in, they go for that walk, they can tangibly touch that, relief valve and just give themselves some of that opportunity to be a happier individual. So
100%.
I love how you said that. I think self-care is such an important topic. for young people. And can I go back to COVID for a minute? You mentioned COVID.
Sure.
COVID's like such a big topic. I think obviously it impacted so many families in so many different ways. I'm thankful we're now talking more openly about health and wellness. I feel like everywhere I look, there's been conversation about it. When you think about, the students you have contact with regularly pre-COVID and the students you have contact with now post-COVID, what would you say is one of the bigger changes you've noticed?
Oh, that's a really good question. Um, I'm noticing more, well, I think I'm noticing more pre, different during, and getting back to some of those pre's again,
Mm-hmm.
a return to that. Um, I'm seeing a skill set of students being able to have a better baseline, again, of how to have these social interactions that don't seem so isolationist, quite
Mm-hmm.
honestly. I can enter into a collaborative situation and have some foundational skills. We were seeing some of that as a gap, right? And when I talk about education, sometimes I talk about the concept of windows and that there are developmental windows that we take advantage of and teach into, right? As the brain literally is formulating.
Mm-hmm.
And we missed out on some of those windows in some places and spaces with COVID. Just the interaction component, the human interaction component during, it was prolonged for some people. And those, not in all cases, but students, for example, pre-COVID with issues around social anxiety, right? That's hard. Being around people and negotiating these different environments, really hard. So during COVID, some of those students with that presentation, they were living their best selves, and
Yeah.
they were feeling successful because I didn't have to worry about the nuances of these different environments that I was stepping into as a teenager or as a school-aged kiddo.
Mm-hmm.
And this jam of being on a screen and dialing in and being isolated in many ways works very well for my disability
Absolutely. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
because that's easier for me than having to do this other.
Mm-hmm.
And so I would say that was a big piece that I was very cognizant of. And then, okay, for these windows that may have shut a little bit, how do we pry back open and teach into those skills that kids don't have yet? I'm a big proponent on that word yet, because I think it is mindset. I think that we can always do better
Mm-hmm.
and be better for ourselves and for each other and get smarter about a lot of different things. I think that's very much a malleable construct in my mind.
I think you're right. I think you're right. And it's I hadn't thought of that, but that's a really good point around social anxiety. And I think, for some of those kids to sort of, I mean, I've had a number of kids over the last couple of years say to me, COVID was my brightest moment. Like I loved COVID, because it just worked for them, and then to have to sort of shift out of that, some of the kids, as you know, wouldn't go back to school. They would sort of school refuse. So it does make sense. I mean, it was such a huge shift for so many, not only kids, but families in general for so many different reasons. I'm curious your thoughts on something. So, I look up stats from time to time and the stats on college campuses, are oftentimes as few as 11% of kids that need help actually get it. So, the number is way lower than we'd want it to be. With some of the stats out there, as high as 70 to 80% of kids having mental health issues on campuses. When I look at those stats on the high school level, they're a bit better, but not by much. And I guess I'm curious, in general, why would you say so many kids out there that need help don't get it?
So I think a couple of things. I think first and foremost is that there is a fear of looking different. that if I express that I need X, then I'm also making assumption that my friends don't, that other students don't, and I look different. And as students are trying to figure out who they are, that's a real scary thought, right? So I keep that in.
Yeah.
And I might have these, we'll take it through the lens of anxiety, because we see a lot of anxiety, right? And I have these internalized thoughts, these internalized fears. And instead of sharing them with a trusted adult, I hold on to them. And I actually think that what I'm experiencing is not normal.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't want to run the risk of putting myself out there and exposing my unnormal kinds of thoughts, feelings, behaviors, right? That's why I think that podcasts like these are so absolutely imperative, and to get out and to normalize these conversations, to say, listen, fears, worries, completely okay. That actually makes you human. Everybody has fears and worries. When we have to maybe do something a little bit different is when they start having strength that gets in the way of doing things that you love to do, whether that be being with your family or friends or playing sports or, doing something that you really love doing. Then we just have to talk about what's getting in the way, right? So sometimes kids think, okay, I have this fear. I have this fear of X. So I have to remove whatever is causing that fear. Let's take dogs. So I try to work around and never see a dog and never be in places where there's dogs, instead of saying, okay, what am I going to do when I run into a dog? Like, how do I develop the tools to kind of pivot around and figure that out? So I do very much believe in some pedagogy of a woman named Lynn Lyons. She is what I believe is an expert in anxiety, and she talks about anxiety being this insatiable beast. And that when you try to remove what's making you worry or anxious, anxiety will always replace it with something else. Right? So I remove the dog, and then I'm fearing that something else. Instead of saying, okay, anxiety is a really normal part of being a human. So what do you do when it shows up? What kind of tools do you have to pivot around it and keep going? Right? How do you have a plan B? And sometimes the plan B doesn't work, and that's okay. Like, things will happen. So I went a little bit on of a bird walk, and I apologize for that. But why don't students access help? I think that they're worried about looking weird or strange, or that they will be different, or their fears or their feelings won't be validated. And so then they become the other. So I'll just hold on to them. This is just me. It's not a big deal. I can handle it. Without having conversations to rely on, again, trusted adults, and or in some cases even an expert, to say, all right, let's talk through this more.
No, I think it's an excellent point. I remember reading somewhere online where there was a conversation, back and forth conversation around anxiety, and someone made the point of, when did we decide that instead of tolerating things, we just eliminate them? Like, so if I don't like to fly, then I guess I just don't go anywhere. If I don't like dogs, I guess I just don't go to like 10 of my friends' houses, versus learning how to tolerate it. And a lot of times in my office, that's the emphasis of, okay, we need to look at this as a very normal, natural part of life.
Right.
And if we can learn how to tolerate it, think of the world we just opened up. And I'm thinking about social anxiety, because it's so pervasive that so many kids have kind of come out of COVID more socially anxious than ever. And again, some kids are just like, well, if I just stay in my bedroom, it's like, well, forever? Like, is that, does that, versus like, let's figure out a way around this. So I think you make a great point. I really want my listeners hearing your point, which was excellent. That is, there's help out there. There's ways to do this that doesn't involve eliminating things in your world. It doesn't involve limiting things in your world. What's interesting about the statistics going up is instead of kids looking at it as I'm weird or I'm different, they're actually in the majority now. So kids that have anxiety, when you look at stats, you're like, okay, many stats show that kids are way above 50%. They're way above, they're in that majority, grouping now. And so I try to point that out to kids. It's sort of like you were referencing junior high before. It's sort of like being in junior high and going through puberty and pretending like nobody in the building, is going through it. Well, everybody in the building is going through it, and so, I try to say that to kids to say, hey, you don't realize it, but in a room of like 25 kids, there's probably 18 kids that are super anxious about things. And being able to kind of let your guard down and realize that is important because that leads to kids actually getting some help and really being able to successfully master some of the tolerance surrounding it. Yeah. So you and I could talk all day long. I don't want to go on and on because you're such a super busy individual, and I appreciate you making the time. I'm going to put you on the spot one more time though.
Sure.
So let me ask you this: I as far as Normalize It Forward goes, the way I've conceptually sort of set it up is I've asked people to nominate a friend, a coworker, a relative. If you have somebody in mind that you think would benefit my audience to be interviewed, I would love to get your thoughts on someone maybe that you'd like to nominate. What do you think?
Sure. And you can put me on the spot, and that's A-okay.
Awesome.
Quite honestly, the first person that comes to mind, and it's in more of a professional capacity, is Justine Ginsburg from the Farmington Valley Health District.
Great.
She has, to this point, there is so much need out there relative to mental health that they've focused all of her time and effort on this topic. And she really wants to work to partner with students and families and practitioners and community members and educators to do exactly what we're doing, which is to normalize these conversations, get resources in people's hands, and share it's okay. And there's helpers out there, and she's certainly one of them. So that's the person that comes to mind for me, Mark.
That's awesome. We will get her on the show. She sounds amazing. Again, I appreciate your time, Sue. And I can only say if your family's out there and kids are out there and you're lucky enough to engage with Sue and to, benefit from all that you've done with people, you're a lucky individual. So thank you so much for what you do. And I just appreciate you making the time to be with us today. So thank you.
I always appreciate you working with us and collaborating for kids. So thanks,
Absolutely.
Mark.
My pleasure. Have a wonderful evening. Thanks again, Sue.
Thank you.
That's all for this episode of Normalize It Forward. May this conversation serve as a reminder that you are never alone in facing your mental health struggles. There are always people who can help. To dive even deeper into our journey of normalizing one of the biggest issues young people face, check out more episodes of the show at youareheard.com. It's UAREHEARD.com. Continue gaining access to the right tools, the best resources, and the most insightful advice to achieve positivity, mindfulness, and genuine happiness.